This presentation focuses on advocacy for clients coping with trauma. And we have in this panel, Leo Martinez, Senior Manager of Training and Technical Assistance at Esperanza United. Dulce, Senior Social Service Advocate, and me, Payal, Director of Strategic Partnership and Community Engagement. We both work at Tahiri Justice Center. This project was supported by our OVW grant, and the opinions and findings and recommendation expressed in this presentations are of the author and do not necessarily reflect the views of the US Department of Justice. Next slide, please. Today, we will begin by explaining and discussing what trauma means. We will also have a conversation about the impact of trauma on the brain and memory, and apply this knowledge and information about neurobiology of trauma to legal services designed for domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking survivors. This will help the participant at the end of the training to have more concrete ways to support survivors if they are triggered when you are working and interviewing clients. Although this focus is on legal services, but all the information can be applied in any kind of supportive services we provide to the clients. And I'll pass it on to Dulce.
Thank you, Payal. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here with us today. I'm going to start off with basic definitions so that we can establish common language on the things that we're going to talk about today. And so we begin with the definition of trauma. And individual trauma results from either one event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that are experienced by an individual in a physical or emotionally harmful way. It can also be life-threatening, and it can have lasting adverse effects on the individual's functionings, mental, physical, social, emotional, and even spiritual well-being. We're also going to discuss persecution as part of the presentation, and so we need to discuss, what that is, and that is a prolonged, cruel, or unjust treatment or control upon someone, the state of being subjected to unjust treatment or control, and it also includes mental pressure or distress. This is one mine? Syria, right?
No, I think...
Oh, I'll pass it on to Leo.
Yes.
Sorry.
Thank you, Dulce. There is a connection between trauma and persecution. And even though there is limited research, there is a growing evidence that stress related to persecution can be traumatic and show some PTSD symptoms in the person. We're trying to focus on this concept because they're going to be applied throughout the presentation and some of the examples that we'll be giving. So next slide. And something that we understand that to have an effect in how we seek help or do certain things that, on our behalf, but it's when someone is a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or trafficking. And one of those things is culture. And sometimes, people understand, well, sometimes culture affects, the way that we seek help, and we all have culture. For example, I usually like to use this example because it shows the variety of opinions. Like, for example, during a Thanksgiving, we are, if somebody at your home is cooking a dressing, and I ask, what is your recipe of dressing? Everybody probably will be coming up with their own recipe that is based on their grandmother or somebody else that, a recipe that's been in the family for a long time. And we see that, how that gets affected by culture, by your own culture. And that means maybe, depending on where you're your parents or your family came from originally, and we know that this affects the way that we seek help because, for example, there are different cultures that act in a different way. For example, here in America, we are a very individualistic culture for the most part. We're really, focused on getting the information right away and trying to speed up the process because we're always on the go. Unlike another culture that could be more collectivist, which is going to be the emphasis will be put on the good for the group and not my own what do you say, not trying to get that information right away. How does this show up? For example, if we're working with someone and they're telling us their story, and there might be someone that comes from a collectivist culture will say more like well, when I was a child, this happened to me, and we're thinking, oh my goodness, this person's gonna tell me their whole life story. And in a way that we want to be trauma informed, we probably need to listen to that story. And as we listen to the story, we check mark information that we need for our intake or for whatever processes that we have in place. And then when she's done or the person is done with the story, then maybe say, well, we do have some more questions, and get that additional information. So that's one way that we can counter, when the cultural differences may show up when we're interviewing somebody. We know also that culture help, affects the way that we seek help is that maybe people bring their own, beliefs like religious or spiritual practices. Someone may say to somebody else, well, I don't want to go there, but somebody refer me to a curandera or a healer, and what he said, maybe that's what they go to instead of, seeking help, maybe of the usual channels that we may think of. It's also, it's affected by the way we understand, for example, the justice system. It is, it is a very complex, and we, sometimes even ourselves who are, very, what do you say, that we understand the system much better. We still may have some issues here or there if we were to be trying to go through it ourselves. So that's some of the things that we need to take into account. We also know that there is also for a lot of people, depending if people are moving, there might be a change of environment, or they might change the way they're living. And sometimes there are even maybe, depending on the culture, depending on somebody was born, there may be even legal differences. So we have to try to gather that information to understand the person better and be able to support in a more trauma-informed way. Next. Although we are focused on all victims, supporting all victims in general, we also want to understand people that have to move, whether it is within the country or from country to country. There might be reasons why people move. The most common one is probably economic opportunities, and that's someone that comes maybe from a different country, or even here that you might move for a different job position that push you into understanding and getting to know your new place better. When you do have the language and you have part of the culture, that might be much easier. But when there is a difference from a different culture, then might be a little bit more complex. As we know that some folks move to the country to reunite with family. For example, we know that there's a lot of unaccompanied minors that are trying to come in on their own to reunite with family here. Sometimes there's education opportunities, and as a reason that people move, just to go to college or fleeing persecution. if they are, for example, there's gang-related activity in their country of origin, and they're being sort of pressure into joining, and people leave because they don't want to join a gang, or they don't want their family to be affected by gang violence. Sometimes the persecution could be on other grounds, political asylum seekers, or if they are LGBTQ, or any other identities. And sometimes people are fleeing abuse. I had the opportunity to work with a group a couple of years ago of survivors of Guatemala, and they were all they spoke Hmong. And one story that stuck with me was of an indigenous woman that was in her country of origin was sold by her parents at the age of 12 years old. So you can imagine the kind of trauma that imposed on this child. And then what is stay with that person, what is that bought her for a while, and then what is eventually she escaped and moved to the United States, and what is and here she was found somebody else who actually abused her. She was suffering domestic violence abuse, and and eventually she found support in this organization that was working with her. So, but you can realize, that kind of a compounding abuse that people sometimes are, the center of. Next slide. I think this is back to you, Dulce.
Thank you, Leo. So before we move on, we also wanted to get a little bit of a picture of the levels of trauma, and how they show up. And so just quickly, at the interpersonal level, that means within the person, my own thoughts, how I cope with stress, how I cope with the trauma, and perhaps what behavioral mechanisms I might learn from the trauma that has happened. Those are at the individual level. Then we have at the interpersonal level, and that requires, at least one more person. That's the interactions that we come up with, or perhaps the trauma or abuse that might happen from one person to the other. Then we have it, a little bit larger at the community level, where number of people can share at least one trait, and they share concepts of trauma at a community level based on that one similar trait that they have. And then we have it at the societal level, much bigger. There's a bunch of communities that are within that society that are all experiencing the same or similarities of the trauma caused at the societal level. And so we also want to talk about collective trauma. Obviously, that connects to trauma at the community level, at the societal level. Community trauma, that means, it's an aggregate trauma that a few or some members of a community experience that has a traumatic impact at a larger structural or societal level. Then, think about community, it can be broadly defined. Like I said, it could just be one trait that a lot of members of that community share. And that can be geographic, that can be organizational, that can be based on the race, based on gender, anything that you can think of in that way. And then we have historical trauma, and that refers to cumulative emotional and psychological trauma over the span of someone's lifetime and across generations. I'm sure a lot of you have heard generational trauma. And we can, that in and of itself can be a whole other presentation to talk about historical trauma and, research how that has shown how that still shows up now, not only in, in the legal system in which we live, but also in survival mechanisms that perhaps some communities have learned to have, and it has become sort of embedded in the culture. And I believe that's back to Leo.
Thank you, Dulce. And thank you for those concepts, going over those concepts. They're very important, especially, we're talking about community or a historical trauma, generational trauma as well. But something that I wanted to mention is in regards to more specifically about survivors of domestic and sexual abuse. They may have some unique vulnerabilities, especially for folks who may come from other countries. You know, I worked years ago, worked years ago with a family, which the mom was a survivor of domestic violence, but she had a child that she had left in her country originally to come here and work, and eventually sent for him. Well, what happened a few years later is that the child's grandmother, what he say, was shot in front of him, and what he say, and then what he say, was killed, and then what he say, the child's aunt decided to take out on a journey to come into the United States to reunite with the mother of the child. And what he's saying, what happens is throughout the journey, what is through different countries, what is they got robbed, what is the aunt got raped, and eventually they got separated at the border, and then he went through the process of being an occupied minor to being assigned to to a nonprofit organization that was working with him, and eventually he was reunited with the mother. But the thing, you can understand the kind of a compounded trauma that happened to this child and all that process, in the country of origin, on the way to here, and then here, because then the mother was telling us that, that she couldn't then relate to the child couldn't relate to her. I says, so we eventually said, this, there's gonna be a long time for this child to actually understand and get, support and help to be able to connect with you, because she hasn't seen you for many years. Pretty much, you two are strangers to each other. So it had to take a long process for them to be able to go through and support it, through a counseling, help that, but also, support through the groups and that program that I was working at the time. So so that's just an example of where I said here, survivors in violence in countries of origin during migration, journey, and destination. And we know that acculturation, which is the process of acquiring the new culture while not losing their own culture, the original culture, has effects on these particular survivors. Like, for example, language. We know that language, when people do not receive services in their own language, they might not get the same level of support, or they might not even get access to support. We know that, I already mentioned, knowing the culture and the systems of the new culture might take a while, and really say, and also during that process might actually suffer from prejudice or discrimination of some kind. We know that when people move, even within our own country here, if I move from here, I'm in the South in Florida, and I move to the Northeast, it's going to be a different culture. And it's going to take me a while, even though I have the language and I have a lot of other cultural things in common. It might take him a little while to understand some things that are specific to the Northeast or the Midwest if I move to other. And the same happens if people are coming from other countries. It might take a while to get that support. And also you lose your support networks. So I may not have anybody if I'm a survivor here of violence and I'm going through domestic violence. I may not tell anything to my family because I don't want to put them into a situation in which they're worrying about me. So that's what happens sometimes. Their networks of support get so small, or sometimes even non-existent, because people are isolated or are being isolated by their partners, and then they're not able to access any support or resources. And we know also that sometimes there's a lifelong consequences of suffering trauma. And we see that sometimes in health outcomes, people developing other things, mental health issues or other physical health issues because of the trauma. Next. And I
That
think,
comes back to me. Mhm.
thank
Thank
you.
you, Leo. So now on to the neurobiology part of the presentation. Why is neurobiology of trauma important to the context of what we're talking about and our work? The understanding of it allows us to be able to analyze the way that the brain is impacted and changed by the trauma during and after the adverse experience has occurred. It also can help us understand the impact on the brain and how that impacts the basic functions, right? It can affect the most basic function of the heart rate all the way down to our responses to stress. And if we understand it, the knowledge of it can help us design trauma-informed services that can, again, improve the way in which we approach these conversations that can never be easy, for someone to revisit a traumatic experience. So some of the most basic things, to start with is understanding how automatic survival responses come up after someone has gone through trauma. During the adverse experience, the brain automatically reacts to put instinctive mechanisms in place for protection. These are adaptive responses that the person has, and is the way that the brain is able to respond while experiencing overwhelming levels of stress. And those responses are freeze, fight, flight, and fun. I'm sure most of us are, familiar with some of them. I'm just gonna go briefly through what that usually looks like. The fight and flight responses, think about those as the two responses that have the highest energy. Fight is, as someone who confronts the threat and is usually comes up and shows up as anger, rage, confrontation, very high energy overall. Then we have the flight, and that's the run away from the threat, which again, it takes a lot of energy to run away from, lion that presents itself, to you. So that shows up with anxiety, it shows up with panic. Avoidance, obviously, if you're running away from the danger, you're avoiding, what's happening. We also have the freeze, and the freeze and the fawn are low energy, right? The opposite of the other two. The freeze response, that one is where we shut down to block out the threat. And that shows as disassociation. So that might show up as, someone who might be completely poker face to a conversation about the trauma that's happening, or maybe someone who's joking about the trauma that has occurred. There's a disconnection between what they're talking about and how they're showing the response to it. Then we have numbness. We also have someone who can be shutting down, right? There's no way that you can have them continue the conversation because there's just so much feeling, so much charge in their body, they're not able to really even formulate a thought. And so all those are very low energy. Then we have the fun. And that one is also very low energy, and it's a way for the person to appease the threat. And so it's a lot of people pleasing and a lot of codependence. And I think often about this specific response because I think it shows up a lot in the Hispanic community for different reasons. But I think one reason that I've noticed, and I'm specifically talking about that, some part of the community, and I've experienced it with a lot of my clients, is there is this power dynamic when they step into the room with their attorney. And not only is this power dynamic make them a lot more peaceful in the situation, but they usually don't want to ask questions. They usually don't want to question what is being asked of them because, the attorney knows best. And who the heck am I to question, what it is that they need. So a lot of that people pleasing might be something that you see more frequently as part of a response when you're stepping into, the room. A lot of times they might not want to be honest and tell you that they're not ready to step into a specific topic, but you will notice it with different reactions. They might be a little bit of hesitant to say certain words. They might take long pauses. They might start shaking a lot. You might see them breathing harder. And so those are things to pay attention to to kind of reset the room, allow them to have a little bit of space and time to process what's happening, and then be able to together figure out how to move forward. Is it the best time to continue the conversation? Should we take a break? Should we do it another day? That's between you and and the client. But it's important to pay attention to those signs. I believe this one's still mine, right? Yes. So key points about the neurobiology of trauma. Understanding the neurobiology of trauma gives us a biological explanation of what happens to the brain during the traumatic event. It gives us a map to be able to understand how your legal cases and the social cases or treatment plans can be approached, and with thinking of the healing of the person in mind. So the credibility, of their narrative is not minimized if the immigrant survivor of violence has disorganized memories. When the brain has been impacted by trauma, it is really, really difficult, almost impossible for them to give you a narrative in a chronological order. That doesn't mean their story is any less important or any less true. There's lapse in memories. Obviously, when the trauma happens, usually what survivors focus on is things that are having to do with their senses. They might remember something that they're looking at while the trauma is happening, something that they feel, something that they smell, something that they taste. So grab onto those memories, because if they start thinking more about, I don't know, something that they tasted, some other memory might be triggered. Don't minimize, that memory. Grab onto those so that you can fill in the gaps of all those lapses in memory. And again, they cannot provide chronological order of events, but just be patient. Understanding the neurobiology of trauma can help us give that context to, get that map during the conversation. And then I pass it on to Payal.
Yeah, I actually want to stay on the previous slide for 1 second, just to give more context on.
Sorry.
No worries. It's okay. Just to give a little bit more context on what you said, just to tag along things. So we talked about key points about neurobiology of trauma, and as also beautifully explained the memory gaps and the lapses. And when I work on my legal case, and I'm pretty sure you all have worked either in your legal case, or you're doing a therapy session, or writing a psychological evaluation, especially when working with survivors of violence, and adding a layer when it's an immigrant, right? It can be frustrating when you are working on a deadline to produce something. But it's really important to tie everything, what just Leo and Dulce mentioned about what are the external factors, or what do we know about trauma, and how we can approach and work with this particular client. I think that's where it ties on, right? As Dulce mentioned, you won't get a chronological order of events, right? Laws are written in a way where you want things to look in a certain way for someone, an examiner or a judge, to give a grant or not, right? Or give an order or not. But that's not how the real world works, right? So we have taken approaches of talking to the client, knowing what we are going in, and getting all the information up front, and build the trust and the relationship and the reputation at that moment, which helps us build their credibility. If there are lapses in memory, what we have done is we know where it's coming from, right? So if we know that there is trauma, if we know that there are various reasons of trauma, and there is a socio, a model there, right? But how do we connect all this? We understand what neurobiology is, right? And that's when we tap into corroborative evidence, right? That's when we tap into external evidence of how we can make sense of what already is there. Can we get a psychological letter, right? Can we get a support letter from a caseworker who may be helping them, get assistance, or shelter, right? All these things helps to explain why there might be lapse in the memory. And it all goes back to neurobiology when you are covering aspects of it that your client is unable to explain, or is giving you information that constantly is changing. it doesn't mean that they are lying. It means the part of the brain is giving information in different phases. And that's the way of the brain to protect this client that you're working with. Next slide, please. And that's why I wanted to like spend a little bit of time as to show how we could cover up like the whole lapses and like all that. And also, mention that we have to be patient throughout the process. And I think that's the key thing that we have to do, especially when we are working with clients. Right? It's important to know and understand that the details, also the reason why they're not able to explain or provide you information, because there is a lot of shame associated with that. When I've worked with a lot of clients, one thing that I've realized is that upfront, obviously, you have to put in, as an advocate, a lot of work in building that relationship. But because it's our job to make sure they are comfortable, not the other way around, right? But also understanding that whenever these gaps comes in, the gaps comes in because there is a lot of shame associated with that, because our clients, they're so vulnerable because of so many external factors, so many things that are going around nowadays, so many things that they are hearing. It just creates a sense of loss of self-esteem, right? Which makes them feel like it's their fault that they are in this situation, which doesn't give us what we actually want eventually, unfortunately, right? Um, so that's something that I really, really wanted to, emphasize on. And this information helps us when we are able to connect the trauma, when we are able to connect the implications and the reasoning behind trauma, when we are able to understand these reactions that Dulce was talking about, or where it's stemming from that Leo was talking about, we are able to then make informed legal strategies as to how we are going to address those gaps when there is a lot of shame. I know that I had a trial where the trial was in and out within like 6 to 8 months. And that's very quick trial. And then the client we kept on asking them about, why do you think this happened to you, right? And she kept on saying that, oh, it's because my husband would get drunk. And I'm not saying that it has to do with any specific gender. It can be any gender harming anyone. But in this particular case, it was a female who was our client. And when she was saying that, it was because my husband would get drunk, and that's when all the abuse start, right? But the reason why we kept on asking that question was, I think it was not because he got drunk and that's what the reaction was, and they kept on giving an explanation for the behavior that wasn't correct, because they felt like they were the one who was responsible for doing something that would switch off and eventually would have to deal with the consequences, which was severe beating, physical assault. And it was extremely traumatic, because the violence was not only against themselves but also the children, right? And so a lot of factors played in, right? And I'm just like showing you that how it entailed. So we had an expert who basically talked about, testified based what was the mindset and how the mindset of the client was, and how the suffering they had impacted on what they were assimilating. Next slide, please. And it goes back to what we just said, right? Memories are associated with emotions. So like when we were working on that particular case, the client kept on not being able to give us anything. So like we chose our wordings very carefully, right? One of the examples here is like, what happened after they tried to strangle you, or versus getting exactly what you need versus like rephrasing it. So you may need a lot of preparation based on who your client is. Some client might just be okay with you asking the direct question, versus some client might be okay with you rephrasing it and taking breaks in between, because it's a lot of what has happened they have to relive when they are telling you the story. And that's why we also work a lot in collaboration with multidisciplinary agencies so that we can avoid the very essence of re-traumatizing someone. Next slide, please. And I think they'll say that's you. Yeah.
Back to me. Yes, thank you, Paya. So, we don't just want to stick talking about the damages done to the brain, because the brain is amazing. And here comes neuroplasticity to the rescue. The brain has the capacity to learn, to change, and to adapt to the surroundings. So let's not lose faith that our clients, are not able to move past the trauma to be able to give you their story. They are so resilient and will always and forever find a way to come through and survive. And so, let's keep neuroplasticity in mind, because this focus allows for the intervention centered around the overcoming of the trauma, right? If we think about all the ways in which trauma affects the brain, then we can think of techniques that we can utilize to facilitate the coping of certain responses that stress might come my brain. And so keeping also in mind, although violence generates disconnection and disempowerment, neuroplasticity and the knowledge of neuroplasticity can tell us that connection and empowerment to the client are key to healing. So, that's where the empowerment comes in, and for our brains to learn how to be able to help our clients. And so we're going to move on to talking about trauma-informed legal services and more applicable ways to put into practice, what we just talked about. So pass it on to Payal again.
Thank you, Dulce. And like we said in the beginning, right? Like this is focused on legal services, but these principles can be applied and should be applied overall to any kind of supportive services we provide to the survivors, right? To the victims who have suffered a lot. And these are the 6 principles of trauma-informed care. Now we know what trauma is. Now we know how it shows up. Let's talk about concrete steps of what we can do. And yeah, next slide, please.
Yeah.
Thank you. So we talked about, right, as Dulce mentioned, like if we know trauma triggers, right, we know this entire process of even taking a therapy or legal services can be very scary. Why? Because we are asking them to think about and remember what has happened to them, right? Not only it will be hard for them, right, to remember what Dulce said, like in a chronological order, but also they may spend a lot of time thinking about it even after your appointments, right? If we don't give them the tools. And I know for sure that happens a lot in legal cases, right? Therapy is a lot better in terms of like providing support. We unfortunately sometimes forget in the back of the head what needs to happen. So I spend a lot of my time making sure I prepare the client by explaining them what the appointment is going to be. And also, if the appointment is 1 hour, spend 10-minute times about just checking with them how they are doing, and then go on what needs to happen. And the last 5 to 10 minutes about what the next steps are going to be, or, just generally checking in with them so that there is some kind of a space in between and they don't only remember what happened in the meeting, but also something else to work on or something else to think about. So next slide, please. And it's really, really important to also like explain them that why we need what we need for, and they then decide what information they are able to provide you, right? Because they are the, owner of the storytelling that they are going to give you, right? And then we work with what we have. So just remember that. One of the most important principle is establishing safety, right? When you're working with survivors, when you're working with someone who has gone through an unfortunate incident or a series of unfortunate incident, we want to make sure that they feel safe to be able to build that reputation with you so that they can continue to work with you. And some of the tips that we use is that have an open body language. I just told you what I do in terms of my appointment if it's in person. Also, if it's virtual, that's usually the thing that we follow through. We takes break. because I also want to tell them that I'm human, right? Like I will say like, okay, give me like 2 minutes, let's take a pause, let me complete my notes, let me make sure I have everything. That also gives them breathing time as well. They don't feel like they have to give you everything in that time period. And if they are not able to, we also offer them what they can do eventually. One of the things that I've always said, that when I see the client, I always make sure that it's their choice where they want to sit. Sometimes they want to sit, in front of me and the door is behind them and they're okay with that. But sometimes they want to sit where they are able to look at the door, right? It could be because of what has happened to them, before. So it's all of that. And just be mindful of, when you're taking notes, explaining them that you are taking notes, and you're not looking at them because you're typing up something, just to make sure they know that you are giving the attention that they deserve, right? Because I'm sure you all are doing it. These are just some of the reminders to establish safety so that we don't miss anything and they don't feel like they're not valued. I'm going to pass it on to Dulce for the next slide.
Thank you, Kyle. So the next principle is trustworthiness and transparency. I mean, I think it's a continuation, obviously, of everything that Payal said. It's important to start slow, start at their pace, right? They might not be able to jump into conversations that are difficult right away. So it might be good to just start off with, getting to know one another, obviously keeping boundaries and ethical principles in mind. But it might be good to just, start off with a little storytelling about yourself, what your role is, a very detailed and brief description too of what your job is, what the process will be like, what the requirements might be like. That way they can have, a little bit of a picture of what things will be like in the next months and the next years. And that might give them a little bit of an ease to know what they're stepping into. So start slow. Get to know one another. Like I said, tell them about what your role is. If you want to share a personal detail about yourself that might help connect with that person, that might also be a good idea. Discuss, what their goals are. Get to know what they're into, what their aspirations are, what their goals are. Because that's, I think, if they know and see the interest that you have in their case, not only, legally, but at the personal level. A lot of our clients, what I notice is that they feel like then you get them. Like you understand why they're doing what they're doing. And if you understand why they're doing what they are doing, then they trust you a little bit more, because then they feel like you have an investment in the entire process. And so, also get to talking about how you will help them reach the goal. And again, I think that goes back to talking about what the legal process is like and what the steps are, what your responsibilities are, and what their responsibilities are in the process, so that, there's a clear understanding of the team collaboration that is going to happen to get that person to their goal. Transparency is also very, very important, like I said, talk about the process and putting the case together. Timelines, I think that also, again, it prepares them to understand what they're stepping into, how long it might take, and set the expectations overall. And offer choice. I think, something that Payal said in terms of where they sit, that's an example of how to offer them choice and empower them, give them options of when and where they would like to meet. We know, you never know what might trigger them. We had a client in Atlanta who had experienced the trauma in an elevator. Our old office was on the 19th floor. And so nobody ever asked her, during the first meeting, about the details of the trauma. And so when she showed up to the office and saw that she had to get in an elevator because we were at the 19th floor, it was very, very difficult for her. She had a panic attack. And so obviously the team stepped in to figure out first, calm her down. What was the trigger? And then from there, they figured out another place to meet up where she didn't have to even see an elevator. They met at a private space somewhere else. And so it's important to, think about what a trauma they might have experienced, what the triggers might be like, because it's important. You never know, something that might be in your office might be the trigger. So give them, the control of that. And control over their storytelling. I think that goes back to everything that we've said, understanding that it's not going to be in the chronologic order we might wish. But it's their story. It's at their timeline. And giving them that empowerment is huge. And then back to Paya.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I'm also scared of elevators. Thank you for sharing that. It is claustrophobic, so I completely understand. Peer support is one of the other principles that, that comes really handy. One of the things that I do, or at one point, I also attended these trainings, and I find them really valuable because you get tips and things that other people are doing, and that's how you build your practice of how you can be trauma informed, right? One of the things I really liked about which I started implementing is, when do you do appointments with your client, right? There are declaration and affidavit writing appointments with our clients. It is not just one appointment, is multiple appointments, right? Because we want to get a lot more information, but also be mindful of what we are, getting the client into. Some clients want the questions in advance so that they can be prepared, right? Because they have to be mentally prepared. And some clients are like, I don't want to think about it, so I am okay coming in and, you just ask questions and I answer as much as I can. Some clients are like, I want to write ahead of time and then send it to you. And after listening to all of this, you'll be like, how is this related to peer support? In a second, I'll tell you. Because when we do these appointments, we make sure that we check in with the client about when their therapy appointment is going to be, right? And we sometimes recommend them that this conversation that we are going to talk about is going to be a really difficult conversation, right? It may trigger them, and that information is good enough, right? And so we usually do this appointment either before the therapy session or after the therapy session based on who the client is and what we are doing. So we offer support in terms of providing them more information about what support groups are available, right? What other things are available for them. During my appointments, we also have client care bags, right, in our offices, thankfully getting donated by the community members, that has like coloring books. And as a lawyer, I didn't learn. I learned from a lot of social service workers who have worked with us in collaboration, and learned from how they keep the client grounded when they are talking about difficult conversation. We also have fidget toys that we use. And at Tahrir Justice Center, we provide interdisciplinary services. So advocates like Dulce and great advocates, right? We work with them together and have them sit in if the client needs that, to provide emotional support. Like I said, when we are working with them, there is no right way of doing things, right? We will make mistakes, right? Nobody is excelled in trauma informed care, but we are all human. So if we recognize that we are making a mistake, we can also take a pause, right? And we can problem solve. And I think that's what is important. So we also talk to the client about what are some of the things in relationship that exist with them in terms of their support, identify what their support looks like, right? What can they do afterwards so that they can feel a little bit more grounded after having an experience or having to deal with a difficult memory, what exasperate them, right? Identifying some of the support that already exists and establishing this relationship with the client with empathy is really important. And that can only happen when we work with our clients together to identify what are the things that triggers them, but also identify what support would be beneficial for them, right? Some in between, I have done many times where I've stopped, because if the client is crying, I'm not going to go on and talk questions. I always offer them, let's take a pause. Let's all like get up, stretch, use the washrooms that are there. Like, do you want to drink tea? Whatever is needed to like get back and circle back to the conversation. If that's an option, If that's not an option, I always make sure I or my team knows that we don't have to continue to have this conversation. But also, if you're working on a timeline, and if there is a deadline, we plan ahead of time. We let the client know that this information is only the information we need, although there is a lot more what we can add on. But this is the timeline. We only would need this. What would be more comfortable? We can do 3 meetings in 2 days if that makes sense for you, so that we can provide you support. But you decide how you want to navigate that and what would be the consequences of if we are not able to figure out a solution for the timeline that we are working on. And that really, really helps. Next slide, and I'll pass it on to you, Dulce.
Thank you. And next one is collaboration and mutuality. Samsa defines this as a principle that recognizes that healing happens in relationships and not just, exchanges of communication, but meaningful exchange of power and decision making. One that doesn't have to be, we don't have to be therapists to be therapeutic in the relationship that we have with our clients. And I think I'm getting very repetitive, but empowering them and allowing them to make their decisions, even if we don't agree with them, as long as we've done our job and providing all the information that they need to make an informed decision. That's all that we can ask for. If they are willing and able to listen and process the information, and then they're able to make their decision, not only is that empowering them, but it reminds them that they have decision-making power. It reestablishes confidence in them. If they feel confident, they feel comfortable with you, and they feel safe in expressing, their questions, their needs, that's a huge step into helping them not only through their case, but in their own personal healing as well. Seeing other people recognize their autonomy, it's huge. Just think about it, on a personal level for you. When someone doesn't question, what I'm asking, or allows me to just vent out, it's a very comforting and healing space when I'm able to do that with my friends or my family members. And it's a reminder that they trust my instincts. And so, their instincts is, I think, what a lot of our survivors have lost trust in, given the traumas that they have been through. And so if there's continuation, or other people that are respecting that and cheering them on as they make their decisions, it builds back that trust in themselves and trust in their instincts. So yeah, share power and decision making, like I said, and recognizing that everybody has a role. You have a responsibility with your own work, but they also have a responsibility within the process. And that's important to establish from the very beginning. And support agency and self-determination. Again, a lot of what I, just said, it's their life and it's their story. Whatever decisions they make are going to be, impactful for the rest of their life. And so we need to respect that. We need to be transparent and explain our role in the process and the options that they have, so that they can make the informed decision. And again, respect the client's decision, even if we don't fully understand with it. One example that comes to mind that just happened, one of my clients was, we were doing an exit plan. She needed to leave her home from her abusive husband. And I was very much focused on arranging, making sure that it was done when the abuser wasn't in the home, that it was done in the safest way possible, arranging transportation and arranging for the shelter to receive her. She was very much focused on very different things. She wanted to make sure she had the time and the space to take her things. And in my social work mind, I kept saying, I was frustrated, like, why is she so hung up on taking this desk? It doesn't matter. We can get her another desk. But I later understood that it was her way of maintaining a sense of control and a sense of who she is and who she was. that was taken away by her abuser. And so, it's good to have these conversations with them. And if they feel comfortable in letting you know, hey, I understand that you don't want me to take this desk, but it's important for me for X, Y, and Z reasons, then, that is not only like, I found it very lethargic in a way because I recognized that she was comfortable in letting me know and fighting me a little bit in the decision-making process, but also, it's her resiliency showing up as well. So again, we might not agree in the process or the decisions that they make, but all we can do is try to understand them and support them with the tools that they need to execute that decision. And then we go back to Leo.
Oh, I think that would be me. Sorry. Yeah, no problem, no problem. Thank you for sharing all that. Now that you know all about the six principles and you have some action items already about, we learned about the trauma and we learned about the six principle. So just keep things in mind. One of the things that Dulce kept on repeating is very important, right? Empowerment. And I think that's what our takeaway is, empowerment and connection, which means that making sure that it's their decision to continue with the therapy, to continue with, not only therapy, but appointment, but filing a case. It's their decision, right? And it has to do with what they are. We have to give them the power back, right? We have to create that safety net where they feel like they're safe to be able to make those decisions. So empowerment and connection are our key takeaway. And also pay attention to their emotions, right? Pay attention to what they can tell us, pay attention to how they are feeling. And all the trauma-informed care that we talked about are going to help them achieve what we aimed for them to achieve, right? The empowerment, the connection with an advocate, the connection with themselves, the connection with their ability to make a decision or getting that desk or not that desk. It's their choice. We have done cases where we had done through the, end of the case, right? Where we are like about to file and the client is like, I don't want to file. And that's their call. And it can be frustrating, I get it, because you put in a lot of effort. But again, it's their call. It's not my call, right? I'm here to do my job for which I get paid. And that's pretty much it. But it's their life, it's their journey. And we are all here to support them. And next slide, please. Perfect. And now that you have learned everything, this is how we prepare to engage with survivors of trauma and build supportive environment, right? And why is that needed? Is because we are then able to make our cases in a much better way, right? We are able to assess what support is needed for a particular client. If we are able to implement all those six principles, right? If we know at the forefront that my intention in today's meeting is to build transparency and trust, because I need to get this information throughout the case in order for me to competently represent this person. I need to have this priority, right? It's my duty to make sure that we are implementing all these things so that the client feels comfortable and supported, which will ultimately lead them to be more engaged, to be able to identify, oh, we are missing this information. For example, uh, you explained me that you have been a victim of domestic violence. An incident happened on this and this date, and it happened near your parents' house, but nobody was around there, right? So what happened afterwards? So I called my sister, blah, 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 right? Do you think your sister would be able to give us a letter of support explaining how you behaved? And that can only happen if the client is engaged in giving me cues which I am noting down and then asking them that, yes, that is something that can happen because of the trust they have with me, right? And the other thing is, right, like also knowing, right, what kind of victimization are we talking about, and knowing that they are okay. Because a lot of time when we work on our cases which involves domestic violence, let's say if we are assisting a client in getting a restraining order, they might be in active harm. right? So our approach would be very different in working with that client versus when they are out of that harm, right? And the harm could look where they're living with an abuser, or it could be that they don't have any place to go to, right? So that they can feel safe. So all of these factors can only be worked out. I can't do my job to assist someone in a restraining order or file their U visa petition or, represent them in a court if I am not able to engage and support with my client to identify what their immediate needs are to be able to do the job that I'm assigned to do, right? And all these principles helps us prepare and engage with the client who has gone through a lot of trauma so that we can collectively build the environment that they need, because I cannot decide if you need what you need because it's not my choice. It goes back to what Dulce said. It's empowering them to make that choice, that it's their choice. And it's my job to give them the information so that they can reach to point A to point B. Next slide, please. And I think I'll pass it on to Leo for this.
Thank you, Pale. When we're working on trying to create that environment that is supportive, we have to be, what do you say, paying attention to a lot of the verbal and non-verbal cues when we're interviewing somebody, because sometimes that trauma may show up in a different way. For example, the person that's the victim, what do you say, is very irritable or downright hostile, and you think, well, this person doesn't seem to be, a victim. Well, there's no perfect victim. So it says, we really have to be paying attention, because that may give us the clue that there has been, trauma in their life, and maybe be able to figure out if we have options for them to offer. If it is maybe you find that, when you're paying attention, that, they tell you like they're not able to sleep at night, and you keep asking some more probing questions, and they say, well, I'm just laying there and just thinking about this and thinking if this happened. Well, then you rest. Well, they're ruminating, and that's a cognitive reaction that may show that this person may have had trauma in their life, or maybe you're working with someone, they tell you, well, I can't do much, I have a chronic illness, I don't know, like fibromyalgia, and that might be something that actually is showing up, is actually showing up that the person had trauma in their life. Or, if you're thinking about behavioral reactions, maybe the person say, well, or they might come to the interview and you're thinking, well, this person seems to be high on something, on some kind of drug, and they might be showing high risk behavior that also maybe actually responds to trauma. So and you can go through the list of the different type of reactions: emotional, physical, cognitive, or behavioral, and figure out how those may show up in the work that you do every day. Next is Payal.
Yeah, that's me. But this is like a wrap-up slide, right? Before I even talk about this, one of the question that came up was that what are some of the tips and methods we use for building relationships or providing support when we're working with clients virtually or on Zoom? And I really like this question because I know I kept on talking about in-person stuff. All the things we talked about, right? We can literally switch it when we are talking to clients over the phone or Zoom. And obviously, things will look a little bit different, right? So we do obviously provide services virtually as well. A lot of our legal clinics happens virtually as well, right? One of the things that I make sure is that I talk to the client, and we give them this option now because we have pivoted from not all appointments in person, but some appointment can be virtually, right? And I'm going to just talk about my legal experience, but I really want to have Leo or Dulce talk about your experiences as well. We do offer them, we want to make sure that they are safe in the room or in their home to be able to talk about these things, right? We emphasize on confidentiality, right? If there is a third person in the room which we don't have a way to know about, right, we just want them to know that if that happens, that breaks confidentiality, and they hold the confidentiality and the privilege that they claim in the end, right? And if we are talking about immigration or restraining order, they want to make sure that they are getting that information that's useful for them and nobody else, because those things are confidential. And it's not to scare them, but so that they can make the informed decision, right? We have done many meetings virtually too, right? We just want to make sure there are no kids around when they're talking about their views, right? So that's something that we also talk with them and make sure that they are okay with having those conversations. We have created many videos about how to log into Zoom, because not everybody is tech savvy. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I'm talking about myself. Every time I do Zoom after 2 months, there is a new feature, and I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? So we created short videos about what to expect in this meeting, right? Depending on the type of relief. We created, it's not like short video about what to expect, but it's like what kind of relief are we going to talk about, so that they know. And some people like to know ahead of time. And also like how to log into Zoom, or how to do a two-step verification process. We try to keep Zoom meetings short because we also know that people tend to, we are not going to be able to provide as much support as having them in person, right? So we try to keep Zoom meetings short and focus on the things that are in hand. We make sure all these things are discussed before we set up a meeting at a time that works for them, so that they're not out and about and talking in public about the legal cases or anything that has to do with abuse, right? So making sure their space is okay when we are doing all that. That's all came to my mind. But Dulce and Leo, like what, things that you have done as well.
I just want to add that it's very important to connect with survivors. And you can still do that through through Zoom, as long as you mention Pyle that that they're in a place that is safe, that is confidentiality is not being compromised. But something that sometimes work with some populations, mostly the folks who might be Latinos or what is African Americans or LGBTQ folks or immigrants. What is it's just maybe share something personal that is helpful. That's not just for you to share anything, but what is something that is helpful in the conversation, that it can bring that person closer to you to be able to connect and be able to do the work that you need to do. Because sometimes if there's no connection, sometimes it's going to be harder to facilitate someone to have a healing or justice, which are pretty big concepts. But yeah, so that's my tip. It's always trying to connect. If the people see us like we're in a pedestal, that we're not reachable, then there will be, well, I don't really want to deal with this person. They'll just probably eventually just go away, or when it's I'll look for somebody else, or look for another organization.
Well, I would just add that it's what has been helpful is consistency and transparency. I think that those are good things to build a relationship out of virtual, platforms. If you say you're gonna call them, call them. If you don't call them, give a brief explanation why. Consistency with, calling, making sure that you call at least once a month, check in how they're doing. Say if there is an update or if there is no update, clients will always welcome you, just letting them know if nothing has changed in the case. They will always be, curious about it. But if you tell them, I've talked to your attorney and there's really nothing to update you on, but I'm just checking to see how you are. Just having that on a monthly basis, they start to, feel more comfortable, and that's a way to be, to build that rapport. Also because there's a lot of scams happening over the phone, I find it helpful to not only send them like a headshot of what I look like, but also my business card. That way they know legit, and it's not just some random person calling. It's good for them to see, put a face to the name if you're not seeing them with, with FaceTime calls or Zoom calls, and it's only text messages and phone number and phones. I think that, I've found those to be very helpful in building relationship with my clients.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, that goes back to the slide as well. One of the things that I also think might be useful, and I think Leo or also I think you mentioned that I think like when you can't call them, make sure to give an explanation as to why and follow up with them. One thing I wanted to also like talk about being trauma informed, right, is not trauma informed if there is an avoidance at our end, right? And that's why it's okay to call out behavior, right? If someone is being rude or dismissive of what you're saying, or um, not picking, like not taking the calls and avoiding the calls, it's okay to call out the behavior because you want to show the concern. You want to make sure that they are okay. You want to talk about, like, you're noticing this, you're not like this. Is there something triggering? Is something happened, right? Because people react differently, and when you are on phone you are not seeing each other, right, as much as you would want to in person, and that shifts the dynamic. So it's okay to name that hey, I've called you 3 times in the last 3 weeks. Is everything okay? I'm concerned about your safety, and I want to make sure that you still want to continue with legal services. If that's not important, not important is not the word, but if that's something that you're not considering right now, we completely understand. I just wanted to make sure you understand, because sometimes people come in and they're like, oh, I want to file a restraining order, right? And then they're thinking about it. They don't want to file it because a lot is going on. They might be looking for a shelter or trying to find a safe space, or they might be dealing with law enforcement officials, or like a lot of stuff is going on, and we know that, right? But how do we communicate when the person is not picking up? So like naming it out that we have been trying to call you and you haven't picked up, but we also know that a lot is going on, but we just want to make sure you are safe. I have had that many a times, and I'm sure you all have too, where unfortunately someone's phone was stolen or broken and they have no way to contact us. So what do we do? So not holding it against them, but expressing concerns that, if you file a restraining order after 3 months, you may not get it, right? Because the idea behind that is it needs to be immediate harm or threat of harm. So that's something that I just wanted to add. With that, some ways to support the client is one of the things that we mentioned about calling the behavior. Listening without interrupting is really, really important, right? Because if they are feeling a lot of emotions and they are going on a different tangent, it's okay to have that, but also like know that when you're working on a deadline, and if they're one of the common reactions that I've seen for trauma is that people go in circles, and when they go in circles they keep on repeating the same things. And I have seen that many a times, right? Because they want to give you the information, but they want you to also know how they are feeling so that you can capture that, right? And so we have to tell sometimes, like, okay, let's take a pause here. And I really appreciate you sharing all that, and it's really important. But I also want us to like move forward to this new thing. That doesn't mean that I'm disrespecting them, but like, how do we bring them back from what is triggering them and refocus on what do we need at the moment, right? And explaining them really, really helps. So just know that giving them time, but also like bringing them back as and when necessary. Otherwise, it would keep on re-triggering them again and again. And providing the information about whatever professional help they have, what is it that we can do, and all that. And work with the client to identify a network and support that they need. And that's something that we should all be doing. I'm pretty sure you are. And I would love to hear from you all if you have any tips and tricks that we didn't cover in the chat as well.